Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yuzril, the game is World of Warships, and this is Mutsu. She's the second of the Nagato class battleships, will shortly be joining the game as a Tier 6 premium, and wait a minute Yuzril, Nagato is Tier 7. What gives? What gives is that several of the Japanese battleship A hulls, Fuso, Nagato and Amagi, have always been in a rather bad place. These were late World War I and early 20s variants that could end up against the likes of Bismarck, Iowa and, God forbid, Yamato. Not very fun. So when 0.6.0 landed, Wargaming pulled Nagato A and Amagi A from the game, leaving the later variants to pick up the slack. Where does Mutsu come into this? Well, unlike the late 30s and World War II era Nagato hulls that are picking up Tier 7, Mutsu's incarnation in-game is an approximation of her mid-1920s setup. Mostly it's her 1924 refit, but the catapult is from 1933, because that saves Wargaming having to work out the crane arrangement that she used with her earlier floatplanes, and they've balanced her for Tier 6 instead. Rumour has it, by the way, that something similar is planned for Amagi A in the shape of Ashitaka, and if the experiment is a success, then I wouldn't be too surprised to see Fuso A pulled down to Tier 5 as Yamashiro. But for today, we're looking at a preview version of Mutsu, and I need to emphasise preview. Wargaming have already indicated that the version the community contributors get is in line for some buffs. I'll highlight these as I go on. Let's start with the weapons, and in particular, one of her party pieces. Mutsu has torpedoes. She gets 2 single tubes per side, firing the same 57 knot, 7 km, 10,800 damage Type 6 as Minekaze. The launch angles aren't great, they're hull-mounted launchers rather than deck launchers, but they did prove a rather nasty surprise for several incautious captains. A good chunk of that, of course, might be because Mutsu's not really been released yet, and her strengths and weaknesses aren't common knowledge. Certainly the torpedoes weren't, until someone's bleep went off. Because they're single tube, they also reload blisteringly quickly, 21 seconds, so if you do happen to miss, well, the torpedo tubes will reload before the main batteries do. Mutsu actually had another 2 tubes under the waterline on each side, when she had torpedoes at all, but Wargaming have opted not to include those. The limits are some rather poor launch angles, the relatively short range by battleship standards, and not great base damage per salvo. They're a useful little poison dagger if someone's getting too close, or you want to finish a crippled target off, but I wouldn't count on being able to make heavy use of them. Despite that, they're still more use than her secondary batteries. Mutsu gets 10 14cm third-year guns in casemates and 2 twin-linked 12.7cm Type 89s in turrets on either side, which is fairly impressive. It's one of the heavier secondary loads at the tier. Then you realise that the 14cm guns only fire armour piercing, so they can't start fires, they have an 8-second reload, and they have an annoying tendency to deflect off cruisers. The 12.7s are a bit better, they do at least fire high X at 12 rounds a minute, but you only get 4 guns a side, and that assumes you can actually hit anything with them. For one thing, their basic range is only 4 km out of the box, and because Mutsu is Tier 6 rather than Tier 7, manual secondaries only improves dispersion by 15% rather than 60%. So yes, the gunners have been drinking with Junyo, they're out of their skulls, and there's not a lot you can do about it short of getting stupidly close to the target. We're talking brawling at 2 km with a Bayern here. While we're discussing gear that might have been more use thrown overboard to save weight, there's the small question of her flak. Since this is essentially an early 20s design, naval aviation was still in its infancy. I believe the first aircraft carriers had launched the year beforehand, 1923. Flak really wasn't a design priority for battleships at the time. Mutsu's main flak defence is her 4 12.7cm turrets. They give a baseline flak of 40 damage per second at 5 km. Backing that up, you have a pair of twin-linked 40mm autocannon for 16 DPS at 2 km, and as a final defence you have harsh language. Oh, and 3 rifle caliber machine guns doing a whopping 5 DPS at 1 km. Your total flak is therefore 61 DPS at 1 km. which is basically half of everything else at Tier 6 by way of battleships, Bayern, 127 DPS max at 2 kilometers, 100 of it at 4.5 kilometers from her 105mm guns. Fuso isn't that far behind. Even the Tier 4 Kaiser B hull has got better flak than Mutsu. In fact, about the only Tier 4 battleship that's worse is the Myogi. Her A and B hulls have got no flak whatsoever, and her C hull comes in at about 51 DPS. Quite simply, if an even semi-competent carrier of any tier catches Mutsu away from cruiser or fighter cover, it's not going to end well for the battleship. Doesn't matter if it's a Langley or a Shokaku, let's just say it's going to hurt and leave it at that. Make friends with your cruisers, guys. If the flak and the secondaries are lacking, then the main armament is pretty decent. Mutsu carries 8 16-inch, 410mm or 41cm, pick your system, rifles in 4 dual turrets. 2 of them super fire forward, 2 of them super fire aft, pretty much the classic ABYZ configuration. These are the highest caliber guns at Tier 6, and like the 15-inch armed Warspite and Bayern, can overmatch the bows of virtually any battleship below Tier 8. And the only reason it's not every battleship below Tier 8 is because Bayern has got this weird little 30mm belt on her waterline that you need a Yamato to overmatch. Fire control is perfectly workable. There's a horizontal error of 231 meters at 20.4 kilometers. That drops to 214 meters with Aiming Systems Mod 1 installed. That's a marginally wider spread than Warspite, but Mutsu is getting those numbers some 25% further out. Vertical dispersion is tolerable for a battleship. The problem is that she only mounts 8 rifles compared to the 12 that the 14-inch armed ships carry, so the lighter armed ships tend to be more reliable simply by virtue of putting more shots down range. Reload on the preview version was a slightly sluggish 35 seconds. The release version is apparently getting buffed to 30 seconds instead, which is going to make quite a bit of difference to her DPM output. Of course, the gun and the fire control are only part of the deal. How good the ammo and the turrets are matters just as much. On paper, her Type 88 armour-piercing shells look pretty good. They've got a base damage of 12,400, and dethrone Warspite's Mark 22s as the hardest-hitting shell in the tier. Assuming she gets the rumoured 30-second reload, she'll put out a theoretical maximum of 198,000 damage per minute and an alpha strike of 99,200. Not the highest in the tier. The 12-gun battleships have theoretical DPMs of more than 200,000, Fuso is best in tier at 260,000, but it's still impressive, and she will still be the hardest hitting of the 8-gun battleships. The catch is that the Type 88 hasn't got great armour penetration. It's one of the key reasons that the old Nagato A struggled at tier 7, and that hasn't really changed. The end result, of course, is that Mutsu also seems to struggle, especially at battleship armour beyond around 15 kilometers. The Type 0 High X round is a similar picture. High damage shell, high DPM for an 8-gun battleship make her look good at first, but when you look at the fire chances, it's rather less clear-cut. Mutsu's base chance is 30%, 8 rounds per broadside. By comparison, Dunkirk has a 35% chance, a slightly faster reload, and she can fire all 8 of her rifles from the bow-on position, and that's when you tend to load high X in a battleship. Warspite's got the same 8 guns, same firing configuration, but she gets a 34% fire chance. And the US battleships have the same fire chance, 30%, but they get 12 rounds per broadside instead. Mutsu doesn't really like playing with fire. The turrets, well, if you're coming off a cruiser or a destroyer, then you're in for the usual shock. The preview Mutsu had a traverse of 3.3 degrees per second, which meant she needed 54.5 seconds to turn the guns 180 degrees. This apparently is something else Wargaming are going to improve to 3.8 degrees per second, implying 47.3 seconds to get the turrets through 180 degrees. If that sounds bad, well, it's actually one of the best traverse rates in the tier. New Mexico and Arizona both crawl along at 3 degrees per second. Fuso is slightly better at 3.2, the Bayern's got a relatively sprightly 3.5, and we're not going to talk about Warspite. Got it? The only ship that actually beats Mutsu is the Dunkirk with her lighter 330mm guns, but then Dunkirk was built to fight the Deutschland class. Despite all of this, you're going to want expert marksmen in your skill builds, or at least several large cans of WD-40, and even then it's often going to be quicker to turn the ship than it is to turn the guns. Which brings us on to handling. A 26.5 knot top speed makes her the second fastest battleship in the tier after Dunkirk, surprise. Unfortunately, she's not particularly handy by the standards of the tier. Her base rudder shift on the preview model was 14.7 seconds, turning radius 770 metres. Again, the rudder shift is something Wargaming have indicated they're going to buff, which I think, if we've read the numbers correctly, is going to come down to around about 13.7 seconds. If you put in steering gears mod 2, you're going to get to something in the low 11s. Doesn't really change all that much, to be honest. Japanese battleships have never been particularly good in the turn, but at least that way you might be able to pull off some torpedo beats if you get a bit of warning. So, heavy hitting main guns with mediocre penetration, decent straight line speed, torpedoes, and a lot of secondaries that can work if you jam the barrels against the enemy's hull before you pull the trigger. So Mutsu's a brawler, right? No. Remember that Mutsu is a 1920s design that made almost 27 knots when her contemporaries were barely breaking 20. How did the design team do it? Well, they pulled two tricks. Both of them cause Mutsu problems in game. Firstly, they went a little bit skimpy on the armour. The design team adopted the same all-or-nothing setup as the Americans, moving on from Fuso's all-over model. Superstructure is the standard 16mm, most of the hull is 25mm, so effectively unarmoured, but any high-X round 150mm or less that doesn't have inertia fusing will probably shatter on the hull. What is armoured are the turrets and the citadel. The main waterline belt and the barbettes get 305mm. For comparison, Arizona has 343mm on her inner belt. Bayern has 350mm on her main belt. The upper belt unfortunately thins down to 229mm, which doesn't help all that much against battleship fire. She's well armoured against cruisers and destroyers, inertia-fused shenanigans notwithstanding, but lighter ships will generally just try to burn her instead. However, while she can bounce 14 and 16-inch fire, she has to be pretty carefully angled to do it. Additionally, her torpedo protection is, well, it's a 21% reduction out of the box, 24% with the damage control mods installed. I'd say don't get hit, but, well, Japanese battleship. Torpedo beating tends to be the exception rather than the rule. The other reason for Mutsu's speed was her boilers. She had 21 of them, generating 80,000 shaft horsepower. For comparison, her approximate contemporaries in the US Navy, the New Mexicos, the Tennessees, the Colorados, generated around about 30,000 shaft horsepower. The problem is that all those boilers have got to go somewhere, and Mutsu's citadel is above the waterline as a result. There is a second layer of armour behind the belt, but it's only 76mm thick, and the way it's sloped doesn't really help, since any mid to long range gunfire that gets through the belt is going to find it presenting a rather flat surface. To cap it all, the citadel deck is only 25mm thick, so plunging fire from enemy battleships is potentially a problem at long range. The end result is that while Mutsu has the highest health of any tier 6 battleship, she actually feels like one of the most fragile, especially against other battleships. If you make a mistake against angling against heavy fire, you are highly likely to pay for it with citadel hits. So, after 48 hours with Mutsu, and bearing in mind that I am not a great battleship player, what did I think of her? First and foremost, she is definitely not a soloist ship, and she is absolutely not a YOLO machine like Tirpitz, and even when divisioned, she shouldn't be at the tip of the spear. She doesn't really have the armour to tank battleship rounds, and that above-water citadel just adds to the problem. The best results I had with her were when working closely with other ships, especially if I could get a tanky battleship, say an Arizona, a New Mexico, or even a Bayern, on point to get the enemy's attention and soak their fire. Even if I could get that, I wouldn't take her into serious competitive play. That high citadel and the lack of flak are just too easily exploited by competent players. Warspite and Bayern can overmatch most battleship bows just as well with their 15-inch guns. The US ships are frankly better tanks, flat out. Fussell packs more raw damage if you can mitigate her fragility and her appalling stealth, and Dunkirk can actually keep up with the cruisers, and all of them have better flak. So in serious competitive play, Mutsu doesn't really have a niche. In random battles, yeah, I enjoyed myself. The torpedoes are good for a giggle, but I suspect a good chunk of that is down to her being a preview ship. I got a fair few comments along the lines of, "What's a Mutsu?" And a lot of people probably didn't know about the torpedoes until their bleeper went off. That might change once she's released and more common knowledge. The odd thing is that despite having a lot of fun with her, I frequently didn't do that well. I only broke 100,000 damage in one game out of about 20, and while the stat sites don't seem to be tracking too well, I would hesitate to say my win rate was much over 50%, but that's a purely subjective recall of the last 48 hours. As a captain trainer, well, right now there's not much competition. The only other premium Japanese battleships are Mikasa and Ishizuchi down in the low tiers, and they only get 30% bonus XP from their camo as opposed to the 50% that Mutsu gets. That might change if the rumours about Ashitaka at tier 7 are correct, but on the other hand, Mutsu can't get into a tier 9 fight on her own. As an advanced player trainer, however, she could be really, really good, precisely because she is not a particularly forgiving ship. If you've picked up bad habits on other ships, maybe you open up too much broadside, you get too close, or you're using saturation and rapid fire to compensate for sloppy aiming work, then you're going to get punished where another ship might let you off. And I certainly felt that my battleship play improved in the 48 hours or so that I had her. But again, that's entirely subjective, and, well, I'm not the world's best battleship driver. Has she got my interest? Oh yes! Wargaming have told the community contributors that the preview version we had is going to get some buffs before release, and we'll have to wait to see the precise effects of those, not to mention the price she goes on sale for, before deciding whether or not to get her. But the last 48 hours have left me wanting more, despite all of her weaknesses and problems, and that might be a good sign. We'll have to see what the final version looks like before I start making any solid decisions there. I am Israel. That has been a slightly longer than intended preview of the upcoming Mutsu Premium Tier 6, and always remember, don't play with fire. Farewell.